Ted Koditschek comes to us today with a long history of academic study in British 20th century imperialism, class, and race studies, and more recently, examination of the social role of evolutionary theory developed during those times. I can give you a whole list of Ted's accolades. Just suffice it to say that each time he publishes a book, he ends up with awards from the academic historian organizations for their quality. Ted, tell us about the old days.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Heidi. As I think Heidi's already warned you, this is going to be a different kind of talk from what we've been hearing today, certainly, and in some ways. Okay, so the first question, that I think we have to ask is, does history have anything to tell us about epigenetics today? And I think, there's good reason to at least contemplate the possibility that the answer is no, it doesn't. I think if you think about all of that we've heard in the last 2 days, it seems to me anyway clear that, on one level at least, the science that we're working with today is so manifestly superior to anything that I'm going to be telling you about, in the next 40 minutes or so, that perhaps we should just say, well, the new science supersedes the knowledge of earlier eras and we can forget about it. So that's one possible answer. On the other hand, we've also heard, although I don't think from anyone in this symposium, that there are some people who say that with epigenetics, we're having a return to Lamarck. So I think probably we do need to look at, okay, who was Lamarck? What did Lamarck say, before we can even assess that question. So anyway, I think it should be clear to you, I'm going to tip my hand here, that my answer to these two questions would neither be number one nor number two. I don't think the answer is nothing, but I also don't think that we've got to return to Lamarck. So what can history provide us? Well, I think the past can provide perspective and context, and that's really what I'm going to be trying to provide today, and raise some questions at the end that maybe if there's a little bit of time we could actually discuss and debate. So the first piece of context that I would like to throw out here is the simple fact that actually if you take the entire range of human history, the notion that acquired characteristics can be inherited was very common. It probably goes back way before recorded history, and it kind of makes sense. People think that if you don't have a theory of inheritance and you're just sort of going on your intuitions, children resemble their parents. What happens to parents depends partly on, what they do during the course of their life. And so it follows that some of what children would inherit would have to do with things that their parents acquired during their lifetime. And I could give you a number of quotes that would indicate that there were people who thought this way at many different periods of history. So I guess the first point I just want to put out here is really, I think, it's the fact that this idea that there are things, genes, that determine heredity, and that is really all that you have to look at in terms of understanding heredity, is actually an idea that's pretty much limited to the 20th century. If you go back before then, you get a much different and wider range of views. Okay, so let me just focus on one particular quote that I can give you. I had a number of others and I cut them. This is well before Lamarck, and this is from Aristotle. We all know that Aristotle was a great philosopher, arguably the first philosopher of biology. And he said, children are born with a likeness to their parents, not only in congenital, but also in acquired characteristics. For before now, when parents have had scars, the children have been born with the mark of a scar in the same place. Well, is this philosophy or is it folk wisdom? I would argue that in this case, it's folk wisdom, and therefore of a piece with what you can find, articulated by many, many different people throughout the ages, both before and since Aristotle. Interestingly, in the early modern period, I think there's an increasing tendency to, kind of focus on these types of things by physicians, especially. In many ways, I think they're asking the same kinds of questions that our researchers today are asking. They don't have the knowledge basis to come up with any, reasonable answers, but the questions are presenting themselves. Okay, so we get into the 18th century, the Enlightenment, we have Linnaeus, the era of classification in biology, and so finally then we get to Lamarck, if I can go in the right direction here. No, still going the wrong way. Okay, so Lamarck. So what is it about Lamarck that makes him new, makes him different, and makes him important in this story? Well, the first place I think we have to begin with is the giraffe. We've actually heard about the giraffe before, and I'm not sure I have to go through the giraffe. Should I go through the giraffe, or can we move on? We can move on? Yeah, okay. All right, so everybody knows about, the argument about the way in which a period of increasing use of the neck to get the leaves over many generations inherited, you finally get the giraffe. Now, actually, Lamarck did use this example, so it's part of his argument, but it's only one part of his argument, and arguably not the most important part of his argument, at least to him. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of put that in context of the argument that he really made. The first point I want to make about Lamarck, though, is that he actually became a Lamarckian rather late, at the age of 56 in the year 1800. So he had a fairly long career as a scientist beforehand, in which he published a number of very extensive multi-volume books. The first one was this sort of description of different types of plants and flowers in France. In 1794, I believe it was, he was appointed professor of invertebrate biology, no, not biology, professor of invertebrate zoology at the Museum of Natural History in Paris. And so he started doing dissections of invertebrates and studies of invertebrates. He came up with this multi-volume study that focused on many invertebrates, but particularly on mollusks. So he has already established a certain kind of reputation as a scientist before he ever comes up with these ideas. The other thing I want to point to is that what's going on here is a kind of a transition. When Lamarck started, he was not a biologist. There were no biologists. He was a natural philosopher. So, what Massimo was telling you about that we're kind of going back to, that's all there was, really, in the mid-18th century. By the end of his life, though, biology was really coming into existence as a discipline, and he is one of the people who is involved in creating that. In fact, he is one of the people who arguably coined the word biology. So part of what we're tracing here is, as I think you'll see, a kind of a struggle to define what should this new discipline be, what should it include, what should it not include. Okay, so now let's get to the meat here. So what is it that Lamarck did when he became a Lamarckian? Well, I would argue two main things. First of all, he took this idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics and turned it into a theory. And not only was it a theory, it was an evolutionary theory. In other words, it was a theory that made a claim that the inheritance of acquired characteristics could create new species, and that this would ultimately reshape the history of life. So this is a pretty big deal, a pretty big change here. Okay, so what I want to argue here is that I think there's a tension in the argument that Lamarck is making between two dimensions. There's what I'll call the macroevolutionary and the microevolutionary. So let's look at the macroevolutionary first. Essentially what Lamarck was arguing is that there's a kind of a ladder that would track the development and the transformation of species from the simplest protozoa, he called them infusoria, up through worms, simple worms, then annelids, then insects, then mollusks, then fish, then birds and reptiles, and other mammals, and of course, not surprisingly, human beings at the very top. He himself referred to the marche de la nature through this process up this ladder. Now, Lamarck believed that all evolution was a response to environmental change. So what's happening here is that all of these organisms at various times are encountering environmental change. They're responding to it. They're developing new shapes, new organs, new capabilities, and so on up the process. He also thought that the simplest organisms were being constantly generated by spontaneous generation, which is why, they're still all around us. And so, some of them are going through this process. But if there isn't environmental change for any of them, then they're staying more or less the way they are. There's a lot more to the theory, but I'll just kind of leave it at that for now. Okay, so look at the giraffe then. Where does the giraffe fit into this ladder of development? I would argue that it doesn't fit very well, right? I mean, are we really going to argue that this process by which the giraffe gets a longer neck is somehow bringing us from, the mollusk to man? I think it's a little bit difficult to make that case. And Lamarck, I think, kind of recognized that. Now, today, we don't really have to face that problem because instead of the ladder, we have, this sort of branching system where we can say, okay, yes, the giraffe and the humans, they have a common ancestor, but it diverged at some point, and, while the giraffe was getting his neck, we were getting bigger brains, but they're sort of parallel processes. But because Lamarck wants to put, his microevolutionary story on this ladder, he's got a problem. He's got a challenge that he has to face. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to look at these two over here. Obviously, these are modern pictures of the cuttlefish and the octopus. And the reason I chose these two is because in Lamarck's ladder, in his own listing of the ladder, these are the two highest species on the mollusk group. So the cuttlefish is the highest and the octopus is directly below us. And, I think if you look at these, you can see how he could make a reasonably plausible argument that the octopus would evolve into the cuttlefish. They're not all that different. The octopus has slightly larger tentacles and a slightly smaller head. The cuttlefish has slightly smaller tentacles, a slightly larger head. It's not, so difficult to put that on the ladder of development. Why get hung up about the cuttlefish? Well, the reason is because of the next stage. Lamarck had to get the cuttlefish up to the fish, right? Which he thought were the most primitive vertebrates. That's a harder jump to make than this. And, he had, not surprisingly, perhaps some trouble convincing the community of biologists that this was a plausible step to take. Okay, so once again, going in the wrong direction. Okay, these are the diagrams that Lamarck himself used. I'm not going to talk about them. We could go back to them if you want. There are some interesting points of refinement that are here. Just look at the ways in which the lines are going. You can see that there's this attempt to put everything in the vertical, but also a recognition that it's not really working, and you have to have some little horizontal things going on as well. Okay, so by the time that Lamarck died in 1830, he was really pretty discredited. In fact, he thought that people were going around and laughing at him behind his back. And he was actually right about that. They were. And the reason they were was this man, Cuvier, Georges Cuvier, who was also, he was the professor of vertebrate biology at the same museum, somewhat younger than Lamarck, and really the product of a different era, and kind of represented the next wave in French biology, the development of French biology. And Lamarck and Cuvier were different in almost every respect. I mean, at the most basic level, Lamarck was not very astute politically, whereas Cuvier clearly was. But I would argue that the difference goes much deeper. Lamarck was a man of the revolution. He was a product of the revolution. It's not an accident, I think, that he didn't develop his evolutionary theory until after the revolution, because it would have been somewhat dangerous, at least professionally, to develop it before, because his theory is essentially a materialist theory. There's no role for God in it. I mean, Lamarck doesn't deny that God exists. He's not an overt atheist, but there's no role for God in it. And it's an attempt to explain a kind of natural order based on natural processes. Cuvier, on the other hand, was a product of the Restoration. Even though he got his professorship before the Restoration in 1815, the restoration of the monarchy, it was really after 1815 that his career really took off. And Cuvier is a creationist. He's not a believer in this kind of development of the natural order. And I think this reflects a fundamental difference in their understanding of what biology should be. So, Cuvier had the reputation of being a really excellent scientist, and that reputation was based primarily on the fact that he had a really acute understanding of the structure and function of animals. It was said of Cuvier that if you gave him a bone, he could reconstruct the entire organism just from that bone. So he has a very clear and very nuanced sense of how the different parts fit together. And he thought that's the sort of thing that a biologist should be doing. They should be sticking to the museum, sticking to the lab, doing that kind of intricate work. They should not be going around coming up with grand theories that are, wild speculations about the development of the origin of life. So yes, from Cuvier's perspective, it's kind of laughable. So what about, big questions about where things come from? Well, that's not the biologist's business. You leave that to read the Bible, accept the authority of the religious authorities of your day. And Cuvier was quite happy with just thinking that, species were created by God, each one separately. And he did recognize that, science could tell you something. It could show that there's similarities of form. He divided the animal world into 4 embranchements, as he called them, the radiata, the mollusks, the articulata, and the vertebrates. But, there's no evolution or development, no tree ladder of life here. It's simply, for whatever reason, this is the way God has decided to make things, and we can use science to appreciate it, and so on and so forth. So, many things are going on here, but I would argue that one of them is defining the scope of biology. Okay, so by the 1830s and 40s, there weren't very many people who were advocating Lamarck's ideas. If you wanted to find an articulation of Lamarckism, you would really have to go to radical, atheist, socialist publications, primarily in England, like this Oracle of Reason. Interestingly, The Lancet was a place where you could also find defenses of Lamarckism. We don't think of The Lancet as being a particularly radical publication today, but in those days it represented the general practitioners who were feeling very aggrieved about the way they were being excluded from the prime medical positions by the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Surgeons, and so there was this kind of radical idea. Insofar as you could find a reputable scientist who was developing these ideas, this man Robert Grant, who was kind of a self-taught scientist in Edinburgh, very interesting guy. He was one of the teachers of Charles Darwin, and he bought into Lamarckian ideas. He eventually got a position in London, and he did a number of dissections in which he tried to, push the Lamarckian program forward a little bit. So, for example, in 1826, he did some dissections of the cuttlefish. His main area actually was sponges, but he dissected the cuttlefish and tried to make the case that the cranial cartilage on the cuttlefish actually resembled the cranial vertebrae in the fish. And so, yes, maybe Lamarck was right. You really could go up that ladder of life. A couple of years later, he tried to make a similar argument on the sort of leap from the reptiles to the mammals. He heard about the platypus in Australia. It's an animal that both lays eggs and has mammary glands, and he tried to make the case that this is the missing link between the reptiles and the vertebrates. Well, Richard Owen, who was on the last slide, he's sort of the English follower of Cuvier, who was also an excellent scientist, also studied the platypus and made it very clear this is a mammal. It may be a strange-looking mammal. It comes from Australia, but it is clearly a mammal. By the 1840s, late 1840s and 1850s, Lamarckism was actually slowly beginning to become somewhat more respectable than it had been. And this really happened, I would argue, through some indirect means, in particular phrenology. Now, phrenology, if anyone's heard of it today, is often just kind of laughed at as a pseudoscience, and there were some people who thought that even then, but there were many people who actually took it seriously. And I think part of the basis for doing that is that the founder of phrenology, this man named Franz Gall, was actually the first person to come up with the notion that different aspects of mental behavior are located in particular parts of the brain. And while we don't subscribe to this version of it today, in some ways one could argue that it is the origin of that way of thinking. Now, the phrenologists, the popular phrenologists, particularly this man George Combe, who wrote this book, The Constitution of Man, which sold many, many copies, wanted to argue that the skull, sort of reflected the shape of the brain. So, the notion here is that the things that you are good at, your brain is larger in those parts than it would be in other parts. And the popular phrenologist said, well, we can sort of tell what your strengths and your weaknesses are just by feeling the bumps on your head. So you can imagine how this turned into either a parlor game or a business or both very easily. So what is the relationship of this to Lamarckism? Well, the phrenologists also believed that if you felt you were lacking in something, if you worked hard at it, your brain would actually change. That part of your brain would get bigger. So let's say, you felt you lacked conscientiousness and firmness. If you spent years working at that, that would grow. Maybe even the skull would expand a little bit. I don't think they agreed about all about that. And then if you add Lamarckian inheritance, which some of them did, not all of them, then you could see how over a period of generations, this could add up to a pretty significant cumulative effect. In fact, you could even argue that, the human brain was a product of many, many generations of, people behaving in certain ways and thinking in certain ways and developing certain parts of their brain. This was a very attractive way of looking at the world in mid-19th century Britain. This is the period of the early Industrial Revolution, where at least for the middle class, there's a sense that careers are open to talent. You can raise yourself up by your bootstraps. There's this book, Self-Help by Samuel Smiles. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It sold even more copies than The Constitution of Man. And it's not necessarily based on phrenology, but I think you can see that these ideas work together very well at the popular level. And so they're kind of slowly, gradually bleeding Lamarckian ideas into the general public. A key moment here is the publication in 1845 of this book, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which I think Ollie just mentioned yesterday. This is an evolutionary theory that is even grander than Lamarck's, because it doesn't just talk about the evolution of life, it talks about the evolution of everything, from the cosmic dust to the formation of the sun and the planets and the cooling of the earth, and then life, and then civilization, and finally culminating, in Victorian Britain, all in 390 pages. And to top that off, the author, who was this man named Robert Chambers, an Edinburgh publisher, he wanted it to be popular, so he threw God in, appropriately in many places, just to kind of let you know that this is really not atheism. So it actually became, a semi-respectable book, even though some scientists dismissed it. Others thought, well, he's read a lot of science. He's trying his best, even though he's an amateur. And it was widely read. Even Queen Victoria was reading it. So, this tells you that these ideas are beginning to get out there. Of course. Okay, so now we know that through this entire period, Charles Darwin is sitting in his estate at Down House, and he's got this even more radical theory of evolution which he's developed, and he's trying to figure out, how am I going to get this out there in a way that will be respectable? Because he does not want to end up like Lamarck. He does not even want to end up like Robert Grant, or for that matter, Robert Chambers. He wants to, remain a member of the elite. And at the same time, he is determined to come out with this. Well, obviously, that's not our story. But in 1859, he does finally publish The Origin of Species. And there's a general, I think, assumption that, with the advent of Darwinism, Lamarckism went out. But I think that that's actually not true. Actually, I don't think it's not true. It is not true. In fact, if anything, the heyday of Lamarckism really came during the period after the publication of The Origin of Species. And one way we can, know this is that Darwin himself was a kind of semi-Lamarckian. Obviously, Darwin thought that the main mechanism of evolution was natural selection. That was his baby. But he never entirely rejected Lamarckism. His own grandfather had, had a similar theory of inheritance and acquired characteristics. He learned Lamarckism. And in fact, as criticisms began to mount of The Origin of Species after its publication, people began to point out all of the problems with the argument, Darwin actually began to backtrack a little bit so that by 1868, he actually published one of the first attempts to present a mechanism for Lamarckian inheritance, which he referred to as pangenesis. The idea here is that things that are happening in the body are somehow being recorded in these things that he called gemmules in the cells. Somehow those gemmules, either through the bloodstream or through some other way, are getting into the sperm and into the egg, and so then when they combine in the zygote of the next generation, those things become, inherited by the next generation. Clearly, this is in contrast to what, is coming to be known as the germplasm theory, especially with August Weismann, in which the germ cells in the egg and the sperm are separated from the body, and so things that are happening in the body can't get into them, and only the genetic components are inherited. Beyond that, though, I would argue that there are other reasons why Lamarckism was becoming very influential and popular during this period. First of all, there's, the things that potentially could always have made it popular, that it is this sort of progressive system. It's talking about, it's got a kind of a happy story of how everything is going onward and upward, the tree of life. And now that this has been put in a form that is less threatening to people, and we're in a different era, a more perhaps liberal era, there are many people who find this attractive. Interestingly, and I think kind of ironically, during this period, you actually begin to see many conservatives and Christian theologians and other people who are very focused on Christianity go to Lamarck. And why is this happening? Well, I would argue the reason it's happening is that Darwin had actually succeeded in convincing most people, or many people, that evolution really happened. Obviously, there still were creationists then, there still are today, so I'm not saying everybody, but large portions of the educated public. But when they looked at natural selection, they didn't really like it. I mean, it looks too cold, it's too inhuman. Why would God create all of these animals and these species, in such vast quantities simply to destroy them? It's not the kind of vision that we like. So, if you want a version of evolution that's more kind of God-friendly, I guess, that Lamarck, in some ways, is really kind of fits that bill. Beyond that, there are other things that are going on. I'm not going to talk about them. It would take us too far afield. This idea is known as orthogenesis, that somehow there's something built into the organism itself, a tendency to develop not just individually but evolutionarily in a certain direction. This is also connected up with what was known as recapitulation theory, the notion that higher organisms, complex organisms, the embryo has to pass through all of the stages of evolution during its gestation before it finally comes out. If you want, we can ask me questions about that. So all of these things are kind of feeding into popularity for Lamarckian thinking during this period up till about the end of the 19th century. All right, this one I'm going to go through very quickly. I think it was already talked about yesterday. One could tell a very satisfying story about the decline and fall of Lamarckism simply in terms of the history of science, what historians refer to as the internal history of science. You have, Weismann and the segregation of the germplasm, the rediscovery of Mendel's laws, experiments on genes and the actual location of genes on chromosomes, then combine that with population genetics in the early 20th century, all coming together in the modern evolutionary synthesis, the fact that Lamarckian experiments don't seem to be really panning out. So, you could just say that this is the replacement of good science with bad science, science that succeeds with science that fails. And I'm not, going to disagree with that interpretation. But what I want to argue is that the story is a little bit more complicated. And it's worth looking at the complications in the time that's remaining because I think it maybe tells us something interesting about what's going on. I mean, in the first place, even the majority of biologists didn't necessarily dismiss Lamarck until fairly well into the 20th century, at least after 1900. But there are other more complex things that are going on that are affecting the decision about whether people want to accept the Weismann argument or the Lamarck argument, or why they think this dispute is important, why it's significant. Okay, so this brings me to Herbert Spencer, about whom I could go on for far too long, because this is really what my own work is on and has gotten me interested in all of this. So I'll try to keep it to the basics. Basically, Herbert Spencer is somebody who had this kind of unified, I would call it unified field theory of the biosocial. Like Robert Chambers, he, between 1864 and 1892, he came out with this vast system of synthetic philosophy, which went from, the cosmic dust up to modern civilization in Herbert Spencer. The difference was that while Chambers did this in 390 pages, Spencer did it in about 6,000 or 7,000 pages. You can see the volumes lined up here, and these are collected works. Now, you might think these are just obscure things that some crazy person is coming out with, but actually, people were buying this stuff. There were, 368,000 volumes of this that were sold in Spencer's lifetime, and he was getting the respect of some, intellectuals. He was considered to be a very serious thinker. This is Charles Darwin. After reading any of his books, I generally feel enthusiastic admiration for his transcendent talents, and have often wondered whether in the distant future he would rank with such great men as Descartes, Leibniz, etc., about whom, however, I know very little. Well, Darwin actually had some not so nice things to say about Herbert Spencer at other times, but clearly there's a respect going on here. So what is the basic idea here as we go through all these volumes of physical evolution, biological, psychological, social evolution, ethical evolution? Essentially what Spencer was doing is he's trying to abolish the distinction between the macro and the micro, that I talked about with Lamarck. He's trying to say that these are the same thing but at different levels. So through all of these volumes, what you get is just this constant repetition of a certain type of basic argument where you start out with something that's simple, there's some environmental disturbance, the thing, organism, planet, civilization, society responds to it. It differentiates into different parts that have different functions. Then it re-equilibrates, it reintegrates and re-equilibrates with its environment. Another disturbance comes in, the same thing happens. It further divides and differentiates, re-equilibrates, and so on and so forth, onward and upward through the whole thing. So in other words, he's not really wrestling with a lot of problems of how to fit detail into a big general argument because he thinks that, they're all the same steps. So why do you need 7,000 pages? Because he wants to show example after example after example of how this is working in all of these different places. Some people accused Spencer of cherry-picking his examples, but that didn't particularly bother him. So that's the general scheme of Spencer. So what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on exactly how this plays out in terms of human evolution. And here I think the point that needs to be emphasized is that Spencer was both a Lamarckian and a Darwinian. He discovered Lamarckian ideas very young, and they were always very important to him. When Darwin published The Origin of Species, Spencer accepted it. He was on board with it. The only problem he had was that he hadn't invented the idea himself. And actually, there's an interesting reason why he didn't, because he actually came fairly close to it, but I won't get into that. He did, however, coin the phrase survival of the fittest, which Darwin adopted for later editions of the, of the Origin of Species. So he's an important figure. So for these things have to work together for Spencer, and I think that's absolutely key. So let's take the origins of human beings. Spencer assumed that the pre-human animal was something that would resemble a modern ape. So this is a chimpanzee skull and a human skull. And Spencer said that, how could this evolution have taken place? What's happening here? Well, you've got an animal where a small brain is getting bigger and a large jaw is getting smaller. He argued this could not happen by natural selection. These are two independent traits. How could they spontaneously be evolving together? How could you expect that to happen? Hence, if you turn to Lamarckism, use inheritance, the principle of the draft, it makes perfect sense, right? You have an animal that's using its jaw less and its brain more, and over a period of time, it will become this kind of animal. So this really sets up the argument that Spencer makes about, the way in which human organisms as well as human society evolved. You start out with a primitive society where everybody has small brains except a few people who have bigger brains, and survival. So they start competing with one another, and the ones with bigger brains do better, and natural selection wipes out the ones that are with small brains, and the ones that are capable of, maybe through phrenological means, Spencer was also a phrenologist in his youth, are capable of increasing the size of their brains, the development of their brains. They start, getting involved in competition with one another. Gradually, you get bigger brains, a society in which everybody has a bigger brain, and then you have a different kind of society that's fitted to that type of a creature. He calls it militant society. Then you get the whole process starting over again at this other level. Now everyone has bigger brains, but some even bigger. Survival of the fittest, use inheritance together, create a situation in the end where all of the smaller brained ones are eliminated, and all of the ones who can increase the size of their brains have done so through competition. And you finally get industrial society, which is the society that he thought existed in his own times. And he thought that this process was still very much at work. So now, even though we have quite large brains, there are a few with very massive brains. I can't imagine who he thought that was in that category, but eventually maybe everybody would, through reading his books, the ones that were capable of absorbing his ideas would have even bigger brains, and the rest would, get eliminated by natural selection. And that in the future you would get some kind of post-industrial society where, we would just be all like Herbert Spencer, maybe. So here's a quote. "Progress is not an accident, but a necessity. As surely as a blacksmith's arm grows large and the skin of a laborer's hand thick, so surely must the human faculties be molded into complete fitness for the social state. So surely must evil and immorality disappear." So that gives you a sense of his vision of how this was working and where it would all end up. So, we have a kind of patterns here. Militant society is a society where there's violent competition, in which groups cooperate with one another, but they fight with other groups. It requires a tribal ethics, but eventually it will evolve into this industrial society where you no longer have the competition of the cudgels. Now you have the competition of the market. The goal is to make a better mousetrap. But Spencer thought this is not going to lead to selfishness. It will lead to this bigger brain, whose ethics will become increasingly altruistic. And so he published this book called The Man versus the State. Interesting, Spencer doesn't have much to say about women and where they fit into this whole scheme. But his man is versus the state because he's someone who can become fully social and fully cooperative spontaneously without the state. And if the state tries to intervene, it'll just do bad things like try to keep the unfit from disappearing and give the fit a disincentive to become even more fit. So what I would like to do is to just focus on the theoretical dimension of what's going on here in terms of nature and nurture. That is one of the subtitle of our symposium. I mean, nature and nurture still represent distinct things in this way of thinking. But if you buy into it, there's a kind of Venn diagram here where there's this intersecting zone in which they really work together. right? So the biological creature is developing culture, developing social forms, and that these things are feeding back into biological changes, which are feeding back into social changes. So in other words, what we have here, I would argue, is a kind of marriage of nature and nurture. In Spencer's term, a unified field theory that would explain both together. And Lamarckism is at the heart of that, what makes that work. So what I want to do now is sort of skip out to the end of Spencer's life when he got into a debate with his old friend Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley had been one of the people who really taught him about biology. He didn't really know that much about it in writing his book. And of course, Spencer thinks that ethics is a part of evolution. It's a product of evolution, but in particular, a product of Lamarckian evolution. And Huxley came at the end of his life to the opposite position. Huxley concluded that ethics is something that has to transcend evolution. It becomes only possible where evolution leaves off. For his successful progress through the savage state, man has been largely indebted to those qualities which he shares with the ape and the tiger. But in proportion as men have passed from anarchy to social organization, and in proportion as civilization has grown in worth, these deeply ingrained serviceable qualities have become defects. After the manner of successful persons, civilized man would gradually kick down the ladder by which he has climbed. So I think what Huxley is arguing here is that you really have to accept the divorce between nature and nurture when it comes to understanding human society and civilization, that this idea of a marriage between them really is just not going to work. Now, in any debate between two old men, I think when the deciding vote is always cast by the next generation. And the next generation clearly cast the vote in favor of Huxley. So this is the period in which we have the development of new kind of social sciences. Some of the leading names up there you will perhaps find familiar. In these new visions of social science, society and biology are separate phenomenon. The evolution of society is seen as occurring through different laws and processes, using different methods, producing different results. And I think a key point here is that from this perspective, Lamarckian inheritance is unnecessary and irrelevant to the agenda of these new social scientists. At the same time, at least in Britain and the United States, you have what's called the progressive era, a new kind of liberal politics in the 1890s, notions that the free market models of the economy are outmoded. Competition doesn't produce optimal social or economic results. Modern society is too complicated to be left to individual chance and choice and competition. The next stage of social evolution, contra Herbert Spencer, requires a strong regulatory state that's capable of applying scientific and technological knowledge to promote the public good. Now, if we move quickly through the 20th century, I think we can see that in biology, of course, many things are happening, but some of the key things have to do with what's going on in the cell. Genes, chromosomes, enzymes, proteins, none of what we've heard in the last 2 days would have been possible without that science. So clearly it's very powerful and effective in the development of biology as a discipline. But I think it's interesting that many of the leaders in this field, I have the quote here from Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the main people involved in the modern evolutionary synthesis. They want to say this doesn't really have that much to do with questions of social and ethical development of the kind that Spencer was talking about. Clearly, this is a period of eugenics, racism, genocide. So Dobzhansky says, equality and inequality of men are religious, ethical, and legal, not biological concepts. Heredity of mental, emotional, and personality development is mostly conditioning, not destiny. So I would argue that in the social sciences in the 20th century, you have a kind of a parallel process. This is the period when academic disciplines get established in the university. They need to prove that they are scientific, but differently scientific. If you look at many of the major theoretical frameworks in these disciplines, behaviorism in psychology, cultural relativism in anthropology, neoclassical economics, modernization or Marxism in sociology or in history, these are all theoretical frameworks that kind of bracket the biological, set it to one side and say we're going to focus on how these things work in their own terms, in uniquely social terms. Obviously, I think that as someone who is a product of that tradition, I think that it's produced a great deal of knowledge that's important, but it's left this hole. So somebody like the anthropologist Marshall Solins can write this book, The Use and Abuse of Biology, but it's mostly about what he sees as the abuse of biology in the social sciences. What is the use of biology in the social sciences? And I think that's a question that has been kind of left with too much of a question mark in this tradition, because after all, human beings are animals. They have an evolutionary past, and presumably that evolutionary past has some impact on their character as social beings, as psychological beings, and so on. Okay, so how is the 21st century landscape changing? Are social scientists rediscovering the body? I think to some extent they are, although I think many don't really know what to do with it. Are biologists rediscovering the impact of society? I think the very fact that we have an LSSP here and every year it has a symposium is itself an indication that at least many biologists feel that way, although every time we hear from Jack that, that he has trouble getting scientists to come to these things. So what does the future hold? Is there a way to heal a rift between nature and nurture? Is there a possibility of some kind of remarriage between the two, or perhaps more realistic to hope for some kind of joint custody arrangement? Can Humpty Dumpty be put back together again? And so what I would really like to do is just end with some questions. The first one isn't a question. I think it's pretty clear that there can be no simple return to Lamarck. Only some acquired characteristics can be inherited. Nothing that we've heard in the last 2 days would indicate that we could go back to the theory that I just described to you earlier. And I don't think there's any reason to think that use inheritance provides a blueprint for the progressive evolution of life. So we can't go back to that. So what is the value of all this history? Well, I would argue that, perhaps this micro-macro relationship is something that warrants a little bit of thought. We saw with one of the things that has been discussed is whether we're just talking about a number of specific micro-phenomenon or whether there's a larger pattern here. And I think if we look back to the history, we can see that, it's always easier and perhaps safer for scientists to focus on narrowly defined specific problems. I mean, that's the way to get your research published in peer-reviewed journals, to get grants. You don't have to worry about someone like Cuvier attacking you if you restrict yourself to careful science. But then there are many questions that you're not looking at that maybe are important to look at. And so I think it's to the credit of people like Lamarck and Darwin that they were doing that, and I think that people now are doing that, and it's a good thing. On the other hand, I think that perhaps history also gives us the lesson that you don't want to go as far as Herbert Spencer, right? You don't want to. You want to wrestle with this relationship, but you don't want to prematurely decide that you have solved it or you have put it all together with something that looks good on paper, but is going to fall apart as soon as people realize that they have different definitions of the term, as we saw, the case with epigenetics, and that will just not hold up. So finally, there's a third issue. Is it possible to understand nature and nurture in a common frame? One question that arises to me is how much of epigenetics can be reduced to the molecular level. I think rightly so. This is the level at which most of the biologists have been working, but almost every paper that we've heard has raised other kinds of questions having to do with behavior, with politics, with social policy, and with cultural values. So how do we integrate that? Are we going to look for a remarriage or perhaps some kind of joint custody arrangement so that, we can talk about these different levels together in the same conversation. But that's really where I will leave it off.
I'm sure we have some questions. I see David up there. You can start yelling if you want.
Yeah, I come from the neuropsychiatric fields.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wonder, one person who seems like he kind of fits analogously to the epigenetics field at least as much as Lamarck, at least when it comes to the neuropsychiatric fields, is Carl Jung and his collective consciousness theories. Certainly, like Lamarck, it doesn't fit the same mechanism, but it just seemed really, really interesting. Every time I hear about this, I go, it sounds like Jung. And I wondered if you had explored that in your concept of this development across history.
Yeah, no, I haven't. Could you explain a little bit what in particular you think you see as being,
Well, I mean,
comparable?
my background is from the neuro side, less the psychiatric side. But Carl Jung had a theory of the collective consciousness that subsequent generations learned from the experiences of the previous generations, which isn't exactly how epigenetics works, but it's pretty analogous, at least as much as Lamarck says.
Well, no, I think that's right. I can see, the similarity there. I guess my response would be that this is part of the problem when you're dealing, with ideas and you don't have a mechanism for them. So is Jung's notion similar? Does he think that this is happening through the same way, through gemmules or through?
I am very far from an expert on Carl Jung.
Yeah,
people always talk in terms of Lamarck as far as epigenetics, and I thought, wow, I'd just love to.
But I think this is maybe a moment when what Massimo said. You don't really know what either Lamarck or Jung exactly were thinking because they don't have a mechanism, so you can't really say, do they think this is happening through the same way? I mean, my understanding of Carl Jung, it was just some kind of mystical collective consciousness. I think in the case of Lamarck, there's at least the notion that there is some mechanism of inheritance that is at work. Now, he's kind of black boxed that because he doesn't understand it, and that's obviously a problem for it. But perhaps, Jung also, was a Lamarckian. I don't really know the answer to that.
Question here. I realize that the term selfish can have many meanings, but how would you put the modern term selfish gene in historical perspective with some of this, say compared to inner need or something like that?
Well, I mean, the selfish gene was coined by Richard Dawkins in 1976 in that book, where he has a very specific argument. That is an argument, is my understanding, that is essentially arguing that natural selection works on genes and genes alone, and not on any other levels. So, in that sense, he certainly would be part of the 20th century story that focuses on genic determinism. And I gather from what people have said yesterday that Dawkins is someone who really rejects epigenetics. Is that fair? That he's not interested in, or he thinks it's not relevant. He's definitely somebody who's part of that tradition of 20th century biology. As Massimo said, I think he was also trying to be a natural philosopher and kind of turn that into a larger philosophical argument and make the case for it.
Question.
Yeah.
So how did Spencer deal with the issue, though, of honest indicators of fitness? I mean, because, it might be all well and good to have a big brain, but you still have to pass your genes on to the next generation, and you have to then, that implies that there is selective reproduction. So, I mean, are you just going to kill off all of your competitors, or are there, that's to me is only missing gap between all of this when you went through that.
Well, okay. I mean, I was trying to go through it maybe too quickly, and it's also not entirely clear in him. But I think this is where having both mechanisms is important to him, because, he does want to say that there are many creatures which will not be able to successfully compete in a more enriched environment. And clearly his definition of what that means is very subjective and culture-bound, we would say from our perspective. But then he thinks that for those who can do it, and that could be a large number or it could be a small number, in order to be able to do it, they need to develop new capabilities, which are not just new social forms and cultural ideas, but also new biological capabilities to be able to to act that way. And that's where the use inheritance comes in. So it's the way I understand it is that natural selection wipes out the unfit, and in that sense he agrees with Darwin, but he's got a much more directed sense of what is the higher environment and what are the higher qualities that are needed to compete successfully for it. Does that sort of?
Well, yeah, I mean, the way they said it, it implies though that the females are always, in all cases, then going to be mating with those males. That's the thing I'm still grappling with. And that
Spencer really didn't have much to say about women.
That's
and
what you said. Yeah,
he didn't deal with that at all, which, I mean, Darwin at least was coming up with a theory of sexual selection.
Yeah.
Spencer, the problem with Spencer is, and I think it's absolutely right, he was focusing on what worked for his ideas, and he was ignoring other things. And Darwin, in some of his less pleasant comments about Spencer, was kind of getting at that he's cherry-picking his examples. But, I mean, I would just say two things about that to kind of, not defend him, but why it's worth even thinking about him. First of all, he was very popular, very influential. But secondly, I think he was raising interesting questions about the relationship of nature to nurture that proved to be unsustainable and that then led to, this divorce that I'm talking about, which we're now, I don't think we can go back, but we're questioning it a little bit.
Some psychologists and ethologists have built a wiggle factor into this whole thing called critical periods, which allow for imprinting, changing behavior during critical stages. Tinbergen, Lorenz, David Buss, people of that nature feel that we are built in with some natural tendencies to learn different things depending upon the situation and what we're exposed to. And that's a very important part of what we can become.
So are you asking me how it would fit into this?
Not really asking. I'm saying it's something which has not been mentioned here much, the fact that human behavior, animal behavior can vary greatly from place to place because there are critical periods which have been pretty well established by people like Lorenz and Tinbergen that allow us or allow animals to take on different characteristics depending upon the situation.
So are you saying that maybe that's something that ought to be included in epigenetics?
I think it's a part of epigenetics because it changes human behavior and animal behavior depending on what they're exposed to during certain critical periods of their development.
Yeah.
Tinbergen's big thing was the imprinting in terms of, if the ducks followed him, they imprinted on him and treated him as if he were the mother.
Yeah. All right. So, I think that this raises the question of, we've looked at specific epigenetic mechanisms, and you have to do that because you have to know exactly what it is you're talking about. But then we also have this question is there a larger epigenetic system? Is there an extended synthesis? Is that a reasonable thing to talk about or to work towards? Maybe it is, but we want to avoid becoming the new Herbert Spencers of, thinking that we have some big synthesis there when what we really have is a number of different things, all of which involve some epigenetic effects and perhaps many of which involve inheritance, but really are separate mechanisms.
I'm going to ask a question that's kind of unfair to ask a historian, but I'm going to do it anyway, and it's open to the whole group. Let's look forward. Let's get in our time machine or our TARDIS and wonder what this conversation would be like 100 years from now at the 114th Life Sciences and Society Symposium. I mean, what are we going to look like then? I mean, in a positive sense, what are the debates going to be? What will be resolved or not?
Well, I mean, I really am inclined to throw that out to the group. I mean, I think there's some question whether we're, even going to be fully biological in the way that we are, to what extent we're going to incorporate other other elements that are either through, through biology or through nanotechnology or some interface between the two, actually perhaps do put us in a place where we look a little bit more like what Herbert Spencer is describing. But on the other hand, that's probably science fiction. So I'm inclined to just not really speculate beyond that.
Okay.
So I don't know, what if other people have ideas about that?
You have the answer. You have a really awesome career ahead of you.
Exactly, it's true.
Well, we tend to focus in small scale on what we're dealing with now. And sometimes when I hear the historical perspective, it makes me wonder about the value of dialing that out a little bit to re-examine what we're talking about now.
So Miriam?
I just want to go back in history to Darwin's time, and I've heard that one of the things that troubled Darwin toward the end of his life or his career was that the estimates of the age of the Earth became much shorter. He had believed in Lyell, and now people were saying the Earth must have cooled much too quickly, and so there's a very few thousand of years in which everything had to happen, and they didn't know about radioactivity in those days. So I was just wondering how much of his retreat to Lamarckism, going away from natural selection, was due to that worry.
I think a large part of it was, I think this is Kelvin argued that that it was not possible for natural selection to have really worked given the time frame that was available. And so that's one of the things that I think perhaps made him think, well, perhaps you need a more rapid mechanism, and use inheritance would provide that. There were other things, though. I think the fact that he didn't have an effective theory of heredity, and Fleming-Jenkin made this argument that basically if heredity is all based on blending, then there's nothing for natural selection to work on. So then you also need some other mechanism to sort of push the thing ahead. So I think Darwin felt that these problems would be solved and that natural selection was right, but they worried him, and it made him think that perhaps he needed to give a bigger role to use inheritance than he previously had.
But conversely, he recognized there were problems with Lamarck.
Yes.
With social insects.
Yes.
So the queen is in an unchanging environment, can carry no information, but has all the babies.
I think, Darwin was biased against Lamarckism. He obviously knew about it from a young age because of his grandfather. He had a rather strange relationship with Grant. They never had any contact later in life. So I think that, for him, Lamarckism was something he was always very suspicious about. He never entirely rejected, but only really kind of turned to when he felt he really needed to.
Karthik?
I wanted to go back to, you described in the 20th century this move away from genetic determinism, in part due to sort of some political commitments to sort of banish biology from any kind of human science. I don't really know what my question is, but it's something about how much do you think that was driven by sort of what those folks thought was good science as opposed to good politics? Which comes first? And the reason I ask is, in part at least in fields like anthropology, I think this is something that sort of, as somebody who sometimes uses evolutionary theory to make sense of human behavior, you do encounter a lot of resistance which starts with, doesn't have anything to do with the science, it has to do with, that's sort of bad politics.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I took this talk in the direction of sort of theory and the separation of nature and nurture, because I think that is, a problem that the 20th century has left us. It's left us a number of disciplines in the social science, and there are, of course, exceptions, but it's left us a number of disciplines in the social sciences which are not well equipped to talk about biology, and, has left biology in a place where clearly we're dealing with these questions, but I don't think we have a very clear theoretical framework for dealing with the molecular level. But how do we talk about it, and how do we think about it when we want to bring in issues of behavior, or culture, or social policy, or politics? And so maybe to get back to combine those two questions, I think that hopefully 100 years from now, we'll be dealing with intellectual disciplines that are not so isolated from one another, and that can bring their theoretical equipment together, so that we can be dealing with it in some kind of a common frame, or at least some decision about where you have to turn to one and where you have to turn to the other. Does that at all answer your question, Karthik?
Yes.
And I can confirm that that process is happening right now in sociology. There's a cognitive sociology that's getting a lot of attention now in the American Sociological Association meetings, and I know somebody who's writing a book on cognitive sociology. Actually, two of them are in process now. So
I really do think
becoming a
it's
thing.
changing. I think that the 20th century is over. We're in the 21st century. We're only at the very beginnings of this. I mean, even in my own discipline, history, which I think is the most resistant, the last issue of the American Historical Review had a section on history and biology. It's completely unprecedented.